General trust gets a buyer interested, but conviction, the deep belief that you specifically can solve their exact problem, takes something more substantial. It takes depth. Case studies, podcasts, long articles, and videos, the kind of content a buyer sinks hours into. This level is where the depth lives. It's called the authority level, and the educational long-form content that builds it is run by the content flywheel engine and the system called Content Continuum. This is part 5 of the level mini-series. Before you watch it, make sure you've seen part 4, Nurture, because this level answers the deeper questions a warm buyer starts asking when they move towards a decision. If you run a business, if you're a founder, or sell professional services, this is the level that turns a warm audience into people who are truly convinced. I spent over 27 years in B2B marketing, and depth is what separates a business people like from a business people trust with something important. In this video, I'll show you what authority content is and why depth compresses months of trust into hours. I will show you why case studies and podcasts and educational long form all do the same job, the outcome it produces, and how that outcome feeds the next level, conversion long form, which is part 6. This is one piece of a bigger framework I call the conversion ecosystem. And my goal is to use this system to help you become the most visible, the most valuable, and the most trusted business in your market. So if that interests you, keep on watching. General trust is not the same as conviction. Nurture builds a warm audience that likes you, remembers you, and stays present. But a buyer who moves towards an actual decision, they need more than to like you. They need to believe specifically that you can solve their exact problem. Let me show you the specific job this level does because it's different from the levels before it. That leap from general trust all the way to a specific conviction is what this level produces. Think about the questions your buyer asks when they get serious. Not the easy questions, the hard ones. Do they really understand my exact situation? Have they solved a problem like this before? Can they actually prove it? These are evaluation stage questions, and they can't be answered by a friendly email or a short post. They need substance, evidence, and depth. The kind of thing that a buyer can examine closely and be convinced by. This is why the warm audience from Nurture is not enough on its own. A warm audience trusts you in a general way, but when it comes time to commit real money or real risk, general warmth gives way to hard scrutiny. The buyer wants proof. They want to see that you have done this before, that you understand the specifics, and that your confidence is earned. Authority content is what meets that scrutiny with substance. Authority content is the deep, substantial material that answers the hard questions and builds real conviction. It's where you show at length and with evidence that you generally understand their problem and have generally solved it before. It's the difference between claiming you're good and showing it in enough depth that the buyer can see it for themselves. Claims build no conviction. Demonstrated depth does. So the job of this level is to turn the warm trust from the previous level into specific conviction that makes a buyer ready to commit. It does that with depth. Content substantial enough that a buyer can examine it closely and come away convinced that you're actually the one to solve their particular problem. And there's a specific reason why depth works so powerfully, which comes down to what depth does to time. Long-form content compresses months of trust into hours of consumption. And that's what the Content Continuum does, the system that runs this authority layer in the content flywheel engine. It is the heart of why this level matters. Normally, trust builds slowly across many small touch points over a long stretch of time, which is exactly what the Nurture layer does across the trust gap. But a single piece of deep, substantial content can do it as well. A thorough case study, an hour-long podcast, a detailed educational video done in one sitting can do what would otherwise take months of scattered touches. The buyer consumes hours of your depth and emerges with a kind of trust that normally takes months to build. There's a name for this exact phenomenon. It's called belief compression, and it depends on structure, depth, and sequencing, not length alone. Making that compression work reliably again and again is exactly what the conversion ecosystem is designed to help you build. Think about why this works. When a buyer spends an hour deeply engaged with your thinking, watching you work through a real problem in detail, they learn something important. They learn more about your competence and judgment than a dozen short posts could ever convey. The depth lets them see how you actually think. That concentrated exposure builds conviction fast because the buyer is not glancing at you across months. They're studying you closely for hours. This connects directly to the trust a buyer needs before they act. Remember that a buyer needs real depth of consumption, not just scattered touches to cross their threshold. Breadth without depth is glances that teach nothing. The content continuum is where the depth comes from. It gives a buyer something substantial enough to consume on their way to conviction, compressing the long, slow buildup of trust into a few deep hours of engagement. So the reason depth is so powerful is that it compresses time. A warm buyer who then consumes a few hours of your depth authority content arrives at a conviction far faster than months of light nurture. This is why you can't skip depth. Light content keeps a buyer warm, but only deep content compresses months of trust building into hours of consumption that turn warmth into conviction. The content continuum is the compression engine that does this. Case studies, podcasts, long articles, and educational videos look completely different on the surface, but they do exactly the same job. Let me be specific about what authority content actually is, because it helps you see how that format converges. The formats vary, but the job is identical. Case studies build authority through proof. A detailed case study shows a real problem, the work you did, and the results you produced. This is shown in enough depth that a buyer can see you have genuinely solved a problem like theirs. It answers the hardest evaluation question. Have you done this before with evidence rather than a claim? Case studies are among the most convincing authority content precisely because they're proof, not an assertion. Podcasts and long-form conversations build authority through demonstrated thinking. When a buyer listens to you discuss your field at length, they hear about how you think, the nuances of your judgment, the depth of your understanding. An hour of hearing you reason through real questions builds a kind of trust that no short piece can. The buyer experiences your competence directly at a length rather than being told about it. Long articles and educational videos build authority through teaching. When you teach a buyer something substantial and genuinely useful in depth, you show mastery in the most convincing possible way by helping them before they have to pay you anything. A buyer who learns something valuable from your depth educational content concludes that someone who can teach this well can surely solve their problem. Teaching at depth is a demonstration of expertise. So notice the through line here. Case studies prove, podcasts demonstrate, educational content teaches, and all three build conviction through depth. This is why authority and educational long form are really the same level. Whether you're proving with a case study, demonstrating with a podcast, or teaching with a long article, you're doing the one job of this level. You're using depth to turn a warm buyer into a convinced one. The formats are just different doorways into the same room. The outcome that this level produces has two parts and both matter. A convinced buyer and a library that keeps convincing new buyers for years. The first is a convinced buyer, someone who's moved from general warmth to specific conviction, who now believes you can solve their exact problem because your depth showed them rather than told them. That conviction is what makes the actual conversion in the next video feel easy. The second part of the outcome is a deep, lasting library. The content continuum deepens trust and builds a library. Unlike short content that does its work and fades, a substantial case study, a thorough education piece, keeps building trust for the longest time. It works with every new buyer who discovers it for years. These deep assets hold the most equity because they keep working the longest. So the outcome is not just a convinced buyer today, it's a growing library of depth that convinces buyers indefinitely. There's a brief but important connection worth noting here, and it's how this level quietly feeds the whole flywheel. The depth content does not only convince a buyer who consumes its whole, it also gets broken down into short form pieces that flow back into the attention layer, refueling discovery. One long case study becomes many short clips and posts through what I call the decomposition system, breaking one substantial asset down into the smallest useful parts. This is part of the flywheel that closes its loop. It means every deep piece that you make does double duty. It convinces the buyer directly and it refuels attention indirectly. I mention it only briefly because the full loop is a system level idea, but it's worth noting that authority content feeds the front of the engine as well as the back. Set the connection aside and focus on the core outcome, a convinced buyer and a deepening library. A convinced buyer is ready to make a decision, having had their hard questions answered by depth. The library is the building asset that keeps producing conviction long after each piece is made. Together, they are what this level exists to produce, and both are things that only depth can create. So the outcome to aim for is conviction built on depth, plus a library of depth that keeps building up over time. Not just a warm audience that likes you, convinced buyers who believe you can solve their specific problem, produced by content substantial enough to compress months of trust into hours. Produce that and you've done the job of this level, turning warmth into conviction and building an asset that keeps doing so. There are two forms of long-form content in this engine, and they do opposite jobs. This level builds conviction. The next level turns that conviction into a decision. Let me show you the handoff, because understanding the difference is the key to the whole back end of the engine. The handoff works like this. Authority and educational long-form produces a convinced buyer, someone who now deeply believes you could solve their problem. But conviction is not the same as action. A buyer can be completely convinced and still not have taken the next step because no one has given them a clear, direct path to decide. This is what the next level provides. Conversion long-form, the content whose entire job is to turn a convinced buyer into a customer. The next video is about that conversion long-form. Things like video sales letter and sales landing pages, which in the flywheel are run by the system called conversion flow. These are still considered long form, but their job is not to educate or build authority. Their job is to take the buyer who's already convinced and give them a clear, compelling path to actually decide. Educational long form builds belief. Conversion long form makes them act on it. This is why the sequence runs education first, then conversion. A conversion asset shown to an unconvinced buyer fails because there's no conviction to act on. But a conversion asset shown to a buyer who's just been deeply convinced by your authority content works. The belief is already there, and the conversion asset simply gives it somewhere to go. You build the conviction with depth, and then you provide the path to act on it. The order matters. So the handoff is this. Authority and educational long form produce a convinced buyer through depth. That convinced buyer is handed to conversion long form, whose job is to turn conviction into a decision. The deep content did the hard work of building belief. The conversion content, which we build next, does the focused work of turning that belief into action. Together, they are the two halves of long form. One convinces and the other converts. Here are the things you need to understand about authority and educational long form. It is a level that turns the general trust of a warm audience into specific conviction, the deep belief that you could solve a buyer's exact problem. In the Content Flywheel engine, it's run by the Content Continuum, whose defining property is that long-form content compresses months of trust into hours of consumption. Depth does what light content cannot. It builds conviction fast. It takes several forms that do all the same job. Case studies build conviction through proof, podcasts through demonstrated thinking, and long articles and educational videos through teaching. All of them build authority through depth. That is why authority and educational long form are one level. The outcome is a convinced buyer plus a deep lasting library that holds most equity because it keeps building trust the longest. That deep content also breaks down into short form that refuels attention, which is part of how the flywheel closes its loop. And the outcome feeds the next level, conversion long flow. Educational long form builds conviction. Conversion long form, run by conversion flow, turns that conviction into a decision. You build the belief with depth first, then you give it a clear path to act on. The two halves form long form. One convinces and the other converts. That is authority and educational long form. Part 5 of the Level mini-series run by the Content Continuum in the Content Flywheel engine. This is one layer of something bigger I call the conversion ecosystem. If you haven't watched Part 4, Nurture, go back for it, because authority content works on a warm audience and nurture is what produces that warmth. Next up is Part 6, Conversion Long Form, where we build the other half of long form. That's the video sales letter and sales pages that turn a convinced buyer into a customer, run through a system called conversion flow. Remember, the most visible, the most valuable, the most trusted business in your market wins. The whole point of the conversion ecosystem is to build a system that makes you all three.